Man, it's finally under 100 degrees in LA. It's barely even 95 now. I think I should go for a drive with the E46. Ah, shit. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Project E46. If you recall in the last episode, I wrecked my car again. And now, a few weeks later, after a few replacement parts have finally arrived, it's time to hopefully fix this thing and get it back on the ground and hopefully get it rolling straight, because I have an event coming up very soon that I cannot miss. Now, fortunately, a very kind soul on the SoCal E46 Facebook page donated their driver front stock suspension to my car just so I could get it rolling around for the time being. I put out an SOS call on Facebook after crashing the car, and this guy stepped up and said, "Hey man, I have some blown spare suspension out of a parts car. You're welcome to come have it. Just come take it." And so I did, and at least now the car rolls around. Though, unfortunately, with the SLR Ultra Angle Kit, making stock suspension fit in the car again was a much more challenging task than it really needed to be, but more on that in a sec. Alright, this is the driver front ISC N1 coilover that's on my car, and as you can see, this lower shock mount took the majority of the impact and completely bent, because this part sits in the knuckle on an E46 front suspension, and this just got totally wrecked. Unfortunately, my trackside fixes to this car made everything worse, because I figured if I take this piece off the coilover, normally it threads onto the shock body right here, maybe I can hammer this straight somehow and get the car at least able to move under its own power, because before the tire and the wheel was completely jammed up against the strut. You can see this is where the tire was sitting on the shock. The car was really struggling to move because of that. I couldn't really steer, I couldn't really move the car. And so, unfortunately, my trackside fixes by taking this off involved using a hammer and eventually a jack handle, trying to stick it in here to try and bend it straight. Now, unfortunately, I trashed the threads in this piece, and unfortunately that meant when I tried to put it back on to move the car again, I trashed the threads on the shock. Now, the shock itself seems okay, at least for now. The adjustment range still works, and it doesn't make any funny noises when I try to compress it. However, by trashing the threads on this, I kind of hosed myself. So what I ended up doing is jamming this thing off with a hammer to at least get it off the shock body, and then sacrificing this lower lock ring. Now, normally on the coilover, you adjust the height of the coilover by moving the shock body up and down relative to this lower mount, and then this lock ring just locks the threads in place, so it locks your ride height in place. Now, because the threads in the shock were totally trashed, I ended up cutting a big notch in this lock ring and then just beating the crap out of it with a hammer until it went down all these threads and effectively chased these threads clean. Now, this took a bit of time to do, but it did end up working pretty well, to the point where this shock, I believe, is savable. Now, fortunately, ISC, like many coilover manufacturers, does sell individual parts for their shock assemblies. So in this case, I was able to call ISC and order a new lower shock mount and a new lock ring. Unfortunately, this is specific to the E46. Obviously, this lower piece has to be machined to fit in the knuckle and have the sway bar mount bracket in the right spot. They didn't have any in stock in ISC North America. ISC, like many lower end coilovers, actually has their products produced in Taiwan. So I actually got a box from Taiwan today covered completely in Chinese from the ISC, the people who manufacture ISC's components. It came direct from them. So from the time I ordered this part from ISC North America to the time I got it, it took about a week and a half, which is not terrible for a special order part from across the world, but definitely something to consider when you buy coilovers is getting replacement parts. How easy is it? I know now that if I bought something more popular like BC Racing, this might have been a bit of a quicker process, but hindsight's 50-50. In any case, now that hopefully these threads on the shock body are sufficiently cleaned up, you can see I ground up all the black coating trying to unmangle the threads. Hopefully I can just spin these lock ring on like this. It's a little bit tight, but it's going. The bottom threads here got damaged the most. There we go. All right, one piece up and over. And now hopefully this piece also will go, a little bit of coercion. This might need a little bit more work. All right, fingers crossed I can get this on without completely destroying the shock. This is basically how I remove these old pieces, by the way, just beating them with a hammer and kind of forcing them across the threads. So it took a bit of time because the bottommost thread on the shock body was still a bit damaged. It's hard to kind of clean that one up because it's slightly smaller than the rest. So it took more force than usual to get this threaded shock body all the way up. But I went and looked at the passenger side coilover, and I think I got the ride height of the shock and the preload of the shock and the spring just about where it needs to be. So let's go pull that spare stock suspension out of the car, get this ISC coilover reinstalled, and then see what we're working with from there. So the problem I ran into when trying to install this stock suspension into my car to at least get it rolling after I crashed it is the fact that I have the SLR Ultra steering angle kit, and it's simply not designed for an OE style suspension. And what I mean by that is that these control arms don't actually allow for enough droop, which is basically, if you look, there's no weight on the steering knuckle here. How far down does this drop, right? That's called droop. And the problem is with not enough droop in these control arms, because they're assuming you have shorter coilover shocks, this OEM BMW shock or any OE style shocks, like an off-the-shelf, you know, Coney or Bilstein or whatever, is so physically long and so tall that the steering knuckle cannot drop down low enough to get this thing in place. So what I ended up doing is actually removing the angle kit from the car, installing the shock, and then installing the knuckle into the shock, then reinstalling the angle kit. Kind of like doing it all backwards, which was a ton of work, and I'm hoping I don't have to do that again to get this out. But we'll see what happens. So I've now unbolted the 3 nuts that actually hold the strut into the strut tower. There's nothing holding this strut up other than the SLR Ultra control arm. This is that's as low as it goes. There's nothing holding this up. I'm pushing this down. That's as far as it goes. So unfortunately, I am gonna have to remove the lower control arm and basically remove most of the angle kit to get the suspension apart again, which sucks.
Once I unbolted the SLR Ultra front control arm, I was able to remove the stock front suspension from the car, and then at that point I just reinstalled the SLR Ultra kit, made sure everything was torqued to spec and everything looked good there, and then reinstalled the much shorter, much easier to install ISC N1 coilover.
But before we get the car back on the ground and roll it around and make sure everything's okay there, I need to do some quick bodywork repairs. Now, I have the camera kind of close, hopefully you can see this. My fender took a bit of a beating. This part got bent in when the wheel collapsed because the wheel just snagged it, and then this part, this big dent from me kicking the car because I was so pissed off. And then on the far side, when they yanked my car out of the ditch, my side skirt and fender got damaged to the base. It like tore through my entire side skirt, which sucks, but I'll zip tie that later. In the interim, I need to get this fender pulled back out so I can mount the flare back up so I can get my wheels on and not rub to death. Now, I've done a video, but the first time I crashed the car, I had to repair it afterwards. I made a video kind of showing what I did. In summation, I'm not a body man. I don't claim to be, but this is kind of the perk of having a cheap drift car where you don't care about it that much. Especially once you do fender flares and kind of everything, all bets are off. So I'm gonna try and get this fender true with a hammer and pliers. Hopefully you guys can't see my super secret project car from this angle. That's why I have the camera kind of tight. So the E46 is back on the ground. Sorry I didn't record too much last night. It ended up getting very dark. But But yeah, the car's back on the ground. I had to air up the rear tires. If you recall at the last event, I was continually dropping rear tire pressures to try and dial in grip to the car. Turns out by the time I got home, these tires are cold pressure, which is just over 12 PSI. I don't want to debeat in the streets. I aired them up back up to 30. And hopefully the car drives straight. We're gonna find out. All right, so yeah, the alignment is definitely way off. I need to go under the car and definitely get some strings out and try and get some sort of alignment on this thing and see what's up with the front end. Yeah, there's just this weird E46 steering racks are not like super precise, especially on a car this old. There's just so many miles in the rack. It's not like super like tight or anything, but this feels kind of off. Maybe it's strictly the alignment because like the wheel is so far off center to keep the thing going straight down the road. But not looking super great thus far.
After returning to the garage, I spent a little bit of time dialing in the ride heights because they were a little bit off side to side. Then from there, I did verify the fact that I reinstalled the SLR kit properly because the adjustable Ackerman could have been off, affecting the steering. It was good, everything was tight. Perfect. Then I busted out the toe plates and measured the front alignment of the car, and sure enough, it had over 1.5 inches of total front toe in, which explains why the steering was so wacky. So then I spent the next half an hour or so getting the toe totally dialed into 0 degrees up front, and the car drives great. Check it out.
Should be good to go, fingers crossed. Unfortunately, in LA, there's not many places I can rip this car around short of the track, which kind of sucks. But here's a little kind of quieter area. So, you know, just a little test. Yep, works pretty well. Thanks for watching.
Next time on Project E46.